20 of the best doctors in the country had already given up, but the one person who refused to walk away was the nurse nobody bothered to notice. The storm outside St. Gabriel Medical Center rattled against the massive glass windows as emergency lights painted flashes of red and blue across the lobby floor. It was just after midnight when the call came in. Every department in the hospital felt it immediately. Phones rang. Elevators were locked down. Security teams appeared from nowhere. Nurses rushed through hallways with tablets in hand while senior physicians abandoned meetings and sprinted toward the intensive care wing. Something extraordinary had happened. Ethan Brooks looked up from a stack of patient charts as the overhead announcement echoed through the building. He was 24 years old, an Omega nurse who worked the night shift because it paid an extra $3 an hour. His scrubs were neatly pressed despite being worn for nearly 12 hours. His sneakers were old. His student loans were overwhelming. His mother was at home recovering from heart surgery. And unlike many people inside this hospital, Ethan couldn't afford mistakes. Through the emergency entrance doors came a team of paramedics surrounding a specialized transport bed. The patient lying motionless beneath the bright lights was instantly recognizable. Alexander Hayes. The sole heir of Hayes' medical empire. Billionaire. Philanthropist. The face of countless magazine covers. The alpha known across America as the Golden Heir. Ethan watched as doctors flooded the corridor. Within minutes, the hospital's most respected specialists gathered around Alexander's bed. Cardiology. Neurology. Pulmonology. Internal medicine. Some of the brightest medical minds in the nation stood shoulder to shoulder. Ethan expected the usual confidence that followed elite physicians. Instead, he saw concern. Real concern. The kind that couldn't be hidden behind professional smiles. Hours passed. The intensive care unit transformed into a command center. Test results arrived. New scans were reviewed. Experts consulted experts. Ethan spent most of the night delivering medications, updating charts, and staying out of the way. Nobody asked for his opinion. Nobody ever did. Near 3 o'clock in the morning, the atmosphere changed. Conversations grew quieter. Faces became grim. One physician exited Alexander's room and shook his head before speaking softly to another. A second specialist stared at a monitor for nearly a minute without saying a word. Then a third doctor simply sat down and removed his glasses. Ethan had seen that look before. It was the look people wore when answers ran out. By dawn, 20 physicians had examined Alexander Hayes. 20 experts had reviewed every possible explanation. 20 highly respected doctors had failed to stop whatever was happening to him. Ethan stood at the nurse's station updating records when a senior doctor walked past and muttered, "We're losing him." The words landed heavily in the silence. A few feet away, a television screen displayed breaking news coverage. Reporters had already gathered outside the hospital. Financial analysts speculated about the future of Hayes' medical empire. Social media exploded with rumors. Millions of people waited for updates. Yet inside room 1107, none of that mattered. A human life hung in the balance. Ethan glanced toward the glass window overlooking Alexander's room. Something bothered him. He couldn't explain it. He wasn't a famous specialist. He wasn't even a doctor. But during every brief moment he entered that room, a small detail kept pulling at his attention. A detail everyone else seemed to overlook. He tried to ignore it. He told himself 20 experts knew more than he ever would. Still, the feeling remained. Stronger now. Persistent. Uncomfortable. As if a puzzle piece sat directly in front of everyone, invisible only because they were searching for something more complicated. Then the alarms inside room 1107 suddenly changed. Several nurses looked up simultaneously. Doctors rushed toward the doorway. Staff members moved with urgent purpose. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. Through the glass, he saw physicians surrounding Alexander's bed once again. The atmosphere shifted from concern to crisis. And for the very first time, Ethan Brooks realized that if he stayed silent, the most important patient in America might never wake up again. The sharp tone of the monitoring alarms spread through the intensive care unit like an electric current. Every available physician moved toward room 1107. Ethan followed at a distance, carrying a tablet he had been asked to update only moments earlier. The corridor felt crowded despite the early hour. Nurses exchanged worried glances. Hospital administrators appeared from nowhere. Through the glass wall, Ethan watched as another team of specialists gathered around Alexander Hayes. The Alpha remained unconscious, his face pale beneath the sterile hospital lighting. Expensive suits filled the hallway as representatives from Hayes' medical empire arrived one after another. Some spoke into phones. Others demanded updates. None of them looked reassured. Inside the room, the physicians reviewed test results for what felt like the 100th time. Every scan had been examined. Every standard explanation had been eliminated. Yet Alexander's condition continued to worsen. "Run the panels again," one doctor ordered. "We already did," another replied. "Twice. Then check them a third time." Ethan lowered his eyes and continued entering data into patient records, but he could not stop listening. The uncertainty in their voices was impossible to ignore. These were people whose opinions shaped medical conferences and research journals. People who rarely doubted themselves. Yet now they sounded lost. Hours passed. The morning sun climbed higher beyond the hospital windows. Reporters continued gathering outside. Security checkpoints expanded across the building. Every television station seemed to be discussing the same question. Would the Golden Heir survive? Ethan finally stepped into Alexander's room to replace intravenous supplies. Nobody paid attention to him. The specialists were focused on a collection of screens displaying laboratory results. He moved quietly, keeping his head down. Then he noticed it again. The same detail that had bothered him all night. Something small. Something inconsistent. Ethan glanced at Alexander's chart. Then at the monitor. Then back to the chart. His heart skipped. The numbers did not make sense together. He reviewed them once more. The contradiction remained. Before he could stop himself, he spoke. "Excuse me, Dr. Vaughn." The room became silent for a moment. Dr. Richard Vaughn slowly turned toward him. As chief of cardiology, he carried a reputation almost as famous as the patient lying in the bed. His expression immediately hardened. "What is it, Nurse Brooks?" Ethan swallowed. "I may be mistaken, but I noticed something unusual in the lab trends." Several physicians exchanged looks. One appeared annoyed by the interruption. Dr. Vaughn folded his arms. "And what exactly did you notice?" Ethan pointed carefully at the chart. "The progression does not seem consistent with primary cardiac failure. Some of these markers suggest the heart might not be the root cause." A brief silence followed. Then a few doctors shook their heads. One sighed. Another returned attention to the monitors. Dr. Vaughn stared at Ethan as though he had suggested something absurd. 20 physicians have reviewed this case, he said evenly. "I am aware," Ethan answered. "I just thought perhaps there could be another explanation." "You thought?" Dr. Vaughn's voice became colder. "Your responsibility is nursing care, not diagnostic theory." Ethan felt heat creep into his face. "Yes, doctor." "Then focus on your responsibilities." A few uncomfortable seconds passed before the room returned to normal activity. Ethan finished replacing the supplies and stepped back into the hallway. Embarrassment settled heavily in his chest. He knew he should let it go. He knew people like Richard Vaughn did not appreciate unsolicited observations from night shift nurses. Yet the uneasy feeling remained. Stronger now than before. He walked to an empty workstation and opened the patient file once more. Line by line, he reviewed every available result. The more he read, the more certain he became that something was missing. Then his eyes stopped on a single entry buried deep within the records. His pulse quickened. It was easy to overlook. Almost invisible among hundreds of pages. But if he was interpreting it correctly, then every specialist in the hospital might be looking in the wrong place. And if that was true, Alexander Hayes had far less time remaining than anyone realized. The hospital cafeteria had begun serving breakfast by the time Ethan finally stepped away from the intensive care unit, but he had no appetite. A paper cup of coffee sat untouched beside him as he stared at the screen of an aging workstation tucked into a quiet corner of the nursing department. Most people were focused on the crisis unfolding upstairs. Ethan was focused on a single line hidden inside Alexander Hayes's medical history. The entry was almost 3 years old. A routine genetic screening performed during an executive wellness evaluation. Most physicians would have ignored it because it appeared unrelated to the current emergency. Ethan nearly had. Yet the more he studied it, the more unsettled he became. He opened research databases. Then another. Then another. Medical journals filled the screen. Complex studies. Rare case reports. Specialized reviews that few people ever read. Minutes turned into nearly an hour. Outside, the hospital continued operating under intense pressure. Inside Ethan's mind, a frightening possibility was beginning to take shape. No way, he whispered to himself. The condition was extraordinarily rare. So rare that most doctors would never encounter a single case during their entire careers. Its early symptoms often resembled common cardiovascular disorders, leading physicians toward the wrong diagnosis while the true cause remained hidden. Ethan reviewed Alexander's laboratory trends again. The abnormal fluctuations. The unexplained responses to treatment. The genetic marker buried in his records. Suddenly the pieces aligned. His stomach tightened. If he was right, every hour mattered. He immediately printed several articles and hurried back toward the intensive care floor. Security was tighter now. Reporters crowded the streets outside. Senior executives from Hayes Medical Empire occupied conference rooms throughout the building. The atmosphere felt less like a hospital and more like the center of a national emergency. Ethan found Dr. Vaughn reviewing scans near the nurses' station. "Doctor, I need a minute." The older physician barely glanced up. "I am busy. I think I found something important." That finally earned Ethan a look. Not a friendly one. "Nurse Brooks, we already had this conversation." Ethan carefully placed the research articles on the counter. "Please. Just look at these." Dr. Vaughn sighed heavily and skimmed the first page. His expression shifted from annoyance to irritation. Then he set the papers aside. "This is speculative. The symptoms match. Partially. The genetic marker is present. That does not prove causation." Ethan struggled to keep his voice steady. "If this is what I think it is, the current treatment protocol may not work." Several nearby staff members glanced toward them. Dr. Vaughn lowered his voice. "Do you understand how many specialists have evaluated this patient?" "Yes." "Do you understand that none of them reached this conclusion?" "Yes." "Then perhaps there is a reason." Ethan felt the familiar sting of being dismissed. The same feeling he had experienced throughout nursing school, during internships, and throughout his career. Yet this time he could not simply walk away. Too much was at stake. "Doctor, please. At least run the additional test." Vaughn's jaw tightened. Before he could answer, another alarm sounded from room 1107. Every head turned. Staff immediately rushed toward the doorway. Ethan followed. Through the glass, he saw physicians moving quickly around Alexander's bed once again. Monitors displayed new warning signs. The situation was deteriorating faster than before. Ethan looked from the room to the discarded research papers still resting on the counter. A cold realization settled over him. If nobody listened soon, Alexander Hayes might never receive the test that could reveal the truth. And according to everything Ethan had just discovered, he probably had less than 1 hour left. The countdown that existed only inside Ethan's head felt louder with every passing minute. Around him, the intensive care unit remained in constant motion. Specialists entered and exited room 1107. Administrators fielded calls from executives. Security officers stood watch outside restricted areas. Yet despite all the activity, nobody was pursuing the possibility Ethan had discovered. The additional test had not been ordered. The rare condition remained uninvestigated. And Alexander Hayes continued slipping further from recovery. Ethan stood frozen beside the nurse's station, staring through the glass. He knew exactly what hospital policy required. Nurses did not override physicians. Nurses did not initiate experimental diagnostic pathways without authorization. Nurses especially did not interfere in the treatment plan of the most important patient in the country. If he crossed that line, his career could be over before sunset. He thought about his mother sitting alone in her small apartment. He thought about the medical bills he was still paying. He thought about everything he would lose. Then he looked at Alexander again. The answer became painfully simple. If he did nothing, none of those concerns would matter. A life would be lost anyway. Ethan took a slow breath and walked toward a diagnostic laboratory workstation used by critical care staff. His hands trembled as he entered the necessary information. The additional screening he needed was specialized but available within the hospital network. Normally it required approval from an attending physician. Today there was no approval. Only conviction. For several tense seconds he stared at the screen. Then he submitted the request. The system accepted it. Ethan immediately felt the weight of what he had done. There was no turning back now. 30 minutes later, while physicians debated treatment options inside a conference room, the first results appeared. Ethan opened the report. His heart nearly stopped. The marker was positive. Every major indicator aligned with the condition he had suspected. The diagnosis that 20 physicians had missed was staring directly at him from the screen. He printed the results and hurried down the hallway. Dr. Vaughn was speaking with several specialists when Ethan approached. "Doctor, you need to see this." Vaughn barely looked up. "Not now." Ethan placed the report directly in front of him. One of the specialists glanced at the page first. His expression changed instantly. Another physician leaned closer. Silence spread through the group. Dr. Vaughn finally took the document and began reading. For the first time since Ethan had met him, the chief cardiologist seemed unable to find words. "Where did this come from?" Vaughn asked. Ethan swallowed. "I ordered the test." Several faces turned toward him in disbelief. "You what?" Ethan held his ground despite the fear rising inside him. The findings match the genetic marker and symptom progression. If the diagnosis is correct, the current treatment plan is targeting the wrong problem. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then one of the specialists took the report from Vaughn and reviewed it independently. Another physician requested access to the laboratory data. A third began comparing the results against Alexander's chart. The atmosphere changed completely. Moments earlier Ethan had been an annoyance. Now experienced doctors were examining the evidence he had uncovered. A new discussion erupted. Different medications. Different protocols. Different priorities. Everything shifted. Then a physician rushed from room 1107 carrying fresh monitoring updates. He handed them to the group. The numbers matched the new diagnosis almost perfectly. Ethan watched the realization spread across their faces. They were beginning to see what he had seen. The truth had been there all along, hidden beneath assumptions and prestige. Dr. Vaughn looked at Ethan with an expression far more complicated than anger. It was the look of someone confronting a possibility he never expected. Yet before anyone could say another word, a nurse appeared in the doorway. Her voice shook with urgency. "We need everyone in there right now." Every physician immediately moved toward Alexander's room. Ethan remained where he was, clutching the printed report. The diagnosis had finally been recognized. But recognition alone would not save Alexander. The treatment that could change everything had never been attempted on a patient like him before, and someone would have to make the decision to try it. The conference room overlooking the intensive care unit had become the center of an impossible debate. Around the table sat some of the most respected medical specialists in the country. Their attention was fixed on a treatment protocol that existed mostly in research papers and limited case studies. Nobody could guarantee success. Nobody could predict how Alexander Hayes would respond. Yet every alternative had already failed. Outside the room, reporters continued broadcasting live updates. Inside, time was running out. Ethan remained near the back wall, saying nothing. He knew he should not even be present. A nurse did not belong in discussions like this. Yet nobody had asked him to leave. The evidence he uncovered had changed that. Dr. Vaughn stood beside a projection screen reviewing the latest findings. His voice remained professional, but Ethan noticed something new. The certainty was gone. For the first time, the chief cardiologist was speaking carefully. "The diagnosis appears consistent with the complete clinical picture," Vaughn admitted. Several physicians nodded. Others reviewed their notes in silence. Finally, one senior specialist looked toward Ethan. "You were the first person to identify it?" Ethan hesitated. "I only noticed a discrepancy in the records." The physician studied him for a moment before turning back to the group. "Then we need to focus on what happens next." The discussion continued for another 20 minutes. Medication adjustments were approved. Monitoring parameters changed. New treatment orders were entered into the system. Every department involved in Alexander's care began moving in a different direction. The hospital transformed almost instantly. Staff members who had spent the last day fighting uncertainty suddenly had a plan. Ethan watched the process unfold from the sidelines. He expected relief. Instead, he felt nervous. Because despite the new diagnosis, nobody knew whether they had acted in time. Hours passed. The treatment began. The atmosphere throughout the intensive care unit remained tense. Every update was reviewed immediately. Every change was analyzed. Nurses moved quietly between stations. Physicians checked monitors repeatedly. Nobody wanted to speak too soon. Near sunset, Ethan was updating charts when he noticed unusual activity around room 1107. Several specialists had gathered near the doorway. One nurse smiled for the first time all day. Another hurried down the hallway carrying fresh reports. Ethan's pulse quickened. He approached cautiously. A physician emerged from the room holding the newest laboratory results. "The markers are improving," someone said. "That is impossible." Apparently not. More staff members began arriving. The news spread through the department with incredible speed. The treatment was working. Slowly. Gradually. But undeniably. For the first time since Alexander arrived, measurable improvement appeared across multiple indicators. Ethan felt his knees weaken with relief. The impossible diagnosis had been correct. More importantly, the intervention had arrived before it was too late. Across the city, rumors began spreading almost immediately. By evening, several news outlets reported that Alexander Hayes's condition had stabilized. Stock markets reacted. Business analysts changed forecasts. Millions of people celebrated a recovery that only a few hours earlier seemed unlikely. Yet the biggest surprise came just after midnight. Ethan was preparing to end his shift when an alarm sounded softly inside room 1107. Nurses entered first. Then physicians. Ethan remained outside until one of the staff members suddenly stepped into the hallway. Her expression was stunned. He opened his eyes. The word spread faster than any official announcement. Conversations stopped. Staff members exchanged looks of disbelief. Ethan stared through the glass. Alexander Hayes was awake. Exhausted. Weak. Confused. But awake. The room quickly filled with doctors conducting evaluations. Questions were asked. Responses were recorded. Initial neurological assessments began. Nearly an hour later, one physician exited the room carrying a clipboard. His expression looked strangely puzzled. "What happened?" another doctor asked. The physician blinked. He remembers his name. He remembers the company. He remembers his family. Then what is the problem? The physician glanced toward Ethan, who stood several feet away. The first person he asked for was a nurse named Ethan Brooks. For several seconds, nobody moved. The words seemed too strange to be real. Among the executives, specialists, and family representatives surrounding the most influential patient in the hospital, the person Alexander Hayes wanted to see was an Omega nurse from the night shift. Ethan honestly believed there had been a misunderstanding. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. The physician nodded. He repeated your name twice. Before Ethan could respond, another doctor approached. "Mr. Hayes is stable. The visit can be brief." Every eye in the hallway turned toward Ethan. Some looked curious. Others looked skeptical. A few seemed openly irritated. Ethan felt uncomfortable under the attention. Just 2 days earlier, most of these people barely knew he existed. Now they were watching him walk toward room 1107. The intensive care room was quieter than Ethan expected. The constant urgency that had filled it during the crisis was gone. Soft monitor tones echoed gently through the room. Morning sunlight filtered through the windows. Alexander Hayes sat slightly upright in bed, looking far different from the powerful executive whose photographs appeared on magazine covers. He looked tired. Human. Vulnerable. Yet the sharp intelligence in his silver eyes remained unmistakable. When Ethan stepped inside, Alexander immediately looked toward him. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Alexander smiled faintly. "So you are real?" Ethan blinked. "Excuse me?" Everyone kept talking around me. Alexander's voice was rough from days of treatment. Doctors. Executives. Specialists. But nobody answered the question I asked. Ethan shifted awkwardly. "Which question?" "Who saved me?" Silence filled the room. Ethan looked down. A lot of people worked very hard. Alexander continued studying him. "That is not what I heard." Ethan suddenly became very interested in the patient chart hanging beside the bed. The attention made him uncomfortable. Recognition had never been something he expected. "You should focus on recovering," he said. Alexander laughed softly. "That sounds exactly like something a nurse would say." Over the following days, something unexpected happened. Whenever physicians rotated through evaluations, Alexander cooperated politely. Whenever executives arrived with business updates, he listened patiently. But whenever Ethan entered the room, Alexander seemed genuinely relaxed. The difference became impossible for staff to ignore. If another nurse delivered medication, Alexander thanked them. If Ethan delivered medication, Alexander asked questions. About the hospital. About nursing. About Ethan's family. About ordinary things that had nothing to do with billion-dollar corporations. The conversations were simple, yet they quickly became the highlight of Ethan's shifts. For the first time, he saw the person behind the public image. Alexander was intelligent, thoughtful, and surprisingly lonely. Years of responsibility had surrounded him with people who needed something from him. Investors wanted leadership. Executives wanted decisions. The media wanted headlines. Very few people simply talked to him like a normal person. One afternoon, Ethan entered the room carrying updated medication schedules and immediately noticed Alexander staring out the window. "Everything okay?" Ethan asked. Alexander nodded slowly. "Do you know something strange?" "What?" "I almost died surrounded by hundreds of important people." His eyes shifted toward Ethan. "But the person who actually saw me was someone everyone else overlooked." Ethan did not know how to answer that. Neither of them noticed Dr. Richard Vaughn standing silently outside the room, watching the conversation through the glass with an expression that was becoming increasingly difficult to read. The attention surrounding Ethan Brooks grew impossible to ignore. What began as quiet whispers among nurses soon spread throughout the entire hospital. Staff members who had never spoken to him suddenly greeted him in hallways. Junior residents asked questions about the diagnosis. Administrators requested meetings. Some people seemed impressed. Others seemed resentful. Ethan preferred none of it. He wanted his ordinary life back. Unfortunately, ordinary was no longer an option. 3 days after Alexander regained consciousness, Ethan arrived for his shift and immediately sensed something was wrong. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. Several coworkers avoided eye contact. Even the charge nurse seemed uncomfortable. By lunchtime, he finally learned why. An internal review had been opened regarding the unauthorized diagnostic test he ordered. Ethan stared at the email on his screen in disbelief. The subject line alone made his stomach drop. Administrative compliance investigation. His hands felt cold as he opened the document. The wording was formal and precise. Hospital policy had allegedly been violated. Proper authorization procedures had not been followed. Questions regarding professional conduct would be reviewed immediately. Ethan read the message twice. Then a third time. The result never changed. The same action that helped identify Alexander's condition was now being treated as potential misconduct. The meeting was scheduled for the following morning. That night, Ethan barely slept. He knew exactly how hospitals worked. Policies existed for a reason. Intentions mattered less than procedure. Even if the outcome had been positive, disciplinary action remained possible. By sunrise, the entire situation felt unreal. He entered the conference room expecting questions. Instead, he found attorneys, administrators, department heads, and Dr. Richard Vaughn seated around a long table. No one smiled. The review began immediately. Ethan answered every question honestly. Yes, he ordered the test. Yes, he lacked formal authorization. Yes, he understood the policy. Each admission seemed to strengthen the case against him. The discussion continued for nearly an hour. Then Vaughn finally spoke. The issue is not whether the diagnosis was eventually confirmed. His voice remained calm. The issue is whether protocol was violated. Ethan felt frustration building inside him. If I had waited for approval, the test would never have been performed. Several people shifted uncomfortably. Vaughn remained expressionless. That is speculation. Ethan stared at him. The patient improved because the correct diagnosis was found. The patient improved because an entire medical team responded appropriately. The room became silent. Ethan suddenly understood what was happening. The story was being rewritten. Not completely. Just enough. The diagnosis would belong to the institution. The recovery would belong to the specialists. The risk would belong to him alone. By afternoon, the decision arrived. Pending further review, Ethan Brooks was suspended from direct patient care responsibilities. The words hit harder than he expected. Years of education. Endless overnight shifts. Every sacrifice he made for his family. All of it suddenly felt fragile. News traveled quickly through the hospital. Some co-workers offered sympathy. Others avoided him completely. Ethan packed his locker in silence. He was placing the final item into a small backpack when footsteps echoed behind him. "You are not allowed to leave yet." Ethan turned. One of Alexander's private security officers stood in the doorway. "Excuse me?" The man handed him a phone. "Mr. Hayes would like to speak with you." Ethan hesitated before taking the device. A familiar voice answered immediately. "Tell me this is not true." Ethan closed his eyes. "Alexander. Did they suspend you?" The concern in his voice sounded genuine. Ethan looked down at the floor. "It is temporary." A long silence followed. Then Alexander spoke again, calmer than before. "Stay where you are." "What?" "Do not leave the hospital." Ethan frowned. "Why?" Another brief silence. When Alexander finally answered, his voice carried a confidence that made Ethan pause. "Because if they think they can punish the person who saved my life without hearing my side of the story, they are about to have a very unpleasant afternoon." By the time Ethan reached the administrative floor, the entire hospital seemed to be holding its breath. News of his suspension had spread quickly, but news of Alexander Hayes personally intervening spread even faster. Conference rooms that were usually reserved for executive planning were suddenly filled with department heads, legal advisors, board members, and representatives from Hayes' medical empire. Ethan sat quietly near the back of the room, wishing he could disappear. Across the long table, Dr. Richard Vaughn reviewed documents with a rigid expression. Nobody spoke much while they waited. Then the doors opened. Every conversation stopped instantly. Alexander Hayes entered the room. The fact that he was walking at all felt remarkable. Only days earlier, specialists had feared he might never recover. Now he crossed the room under his own power, accompanied by 2 physicians and several executives. His face remained pale, and his movements were slower than usual, but the authority he carried was impossible to miss. He took a seat at the head of the table without asking permission. "Let us save some time," Alexander said calmly. "I understand there are concerns regarding Nurse Brooks." One administrator cleared his throat. "The review concerns hospital policy." "No," Alexander replied. "The review concerns accountability." Silence followed. Alexander looked around the room before continuing. "I have spent the last 48 hours reviewing every report related to my treatment." Several people shifted uneasily. "I also requested access to internal communications, consultation notes, and diagnostic timelines." Ethan saw genuine surprise appear on more than one face. Alexander turned toward Vaughn. "Doctor, how many times was the possibility eventually identified by Nurse Brooks discussed before he ordered the diagnostic test?" Vaughn hesitated. "The concern was mentioned." "How many times?" Alexander repeated. A legal advisor opened a folder and answered instead. 3 separate occasions." The room grew noticeably quieter. Alexander nodded. "And each time it was dismissed?" No one answered. The silence itself became the answer. Another document appeared on the large screen mounted to the wall. Ethan stared in disbelief. It was a timeline. Every major event had been reconstructed minute by minute. The presentation showed when Ethan first raised concerns, when the recommendation was ignored, when the test was finally ordered, and when the diagnosis was confirmed. The sequence was impossible to argue with. One board member adjusted his glasses. This suggests the diagnostic pathway was available considerably earlier. Exactly, Alexander said. His voice remained calm, but the disappointment underneath it was unmistakable. The issue is not that Nurse Brooks violated procedure. The issue is that procedure became more important than listening. Nobody challenged him. They could not. The documentation spoke for itself. Then another revelation appeared. Several internal emails showed discussions about controlling public messaging after the diagnosis was confirmed. Certain reports minimized Ethan's involvement entirely. Others reassigned credit to broader medical teams. The room became uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Ethan had never seen powerful people look so nervous. For the first time, Dr. Vaughn seemed genuinely shaken. "I never intended to harm Nurse Brooks," he said quietly. Alexander looked at him for several seconds. Intentions matter. Then he glanced toward Ethan. But outcomes matter too. The meeting continued for nearly 2 hours. By the end, the conclusions were unavoidable. Ethan's suspension was immediately reversed. The compliance review was closed. Additional investigations into administrative conduct were opened instead. Several executives left looking deeply concerned about their futures. As people began standing to leave, one of the board members approached Ethan directly. "On behalf of the hospital," she said, "we owe you an apology." Ethan did not know how to respond. He had spent most of his career being overlooked. Hearing those words felt almost unreal. Across the room, Alexander watched the exchange with a small smile. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, the balance had finally shifted. The truth was no longer hidden. And now everyone in the hospital knew exactly who had seen it first. 3 months later, the grand ballroom of the National Medical Innovation Conference was filled beyond capacity. Physicians, researchers, hospital executives, and journalists from across the country had gathered for one reason. They wanted to hear the story that had quietly become one of the most talked about medical cases of the year. Ethan Brooks stood near the back of the room, adjusting the sleeves of a suit he had borrowed from a friend. He still felt out of place in events like this. The chandeliers overhead sparkled. Television cameras lined the walls. Conversations echoed through the enormous hall. None of it felt real. Earlier that morning, he had finished a normal nursing shift. Now he was surrounded by some of the most influential people in American healthcare. A voice came from the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Alexander Hayes." Applause immediately filled the room. Alexander walked to the podium with the confidence people expected from him. Months of recovery had restored his strength. The headlines had returned. The business world celebrated his comeback. Yet as Ethan watched from across the room, he noticed something had changed. Alexander no longer carried the distant expression that had appeared in so many photographs before his illness. He seemed lighter somehow. More present. The applause slowly faded. Alexander looked across the audience before beginning to speak. "This year, many people have called my recovery a miracle." His voice carried effortlessly through the ballroom. "I disagree." The audience listened carefully. "A miracle suggests something impossible happened." He paused briefly. What happened was something much simpler. One person paid attention when everyone else stopped looking. Ethan immediately wished the floor would open beneath him. He knew exactly where this speech was going. Alexander continued. "I was surrounded by experts. Brilliant people. Dedicated professionals. Yet the person who changed everything was someone most people overlooked." Several cameras turned toward Ethan. He looked down instantly. Alexander smiled. "A nurse named Ethan Brooks." The room erupted into applause. Ethan felt his face grow warm. He had never enjoyed being the center of attention. Yet the recognition felt different this time. It was not about fame. It was about truth finally reaching the people who needed to hear it. Alexander stepped away from the podium and gestured toward the stage. Reluctantly, Ethan walked forward. The applause grew louder. Some people even stood. When he reached the stage, Alexander handed him a small plaque recognizing extraordinary clinical judgment and patient advocacy. Ethan stared at it in disbelief. "I do not know what to say," he admitted. Laughter spread through the audience. Alexander leaned toward the microphone one final time. "Then allow me." The room became quiet again. 20 physicians tried to save my life. They worked hard. They gave everything they had. But the person who truly saw me was Ethan Brooks. He looked directly at him. And I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for that. The applause returned even louder than before. Months later, Ethan would become one of the youngest clinical directors in the hospital's history. His mother's health steadily improved. His future finally felt secure. As for Alexander, he remained a constant presence in Ethan's life. Not because of debt. Not because of obligation. But because somewhere between crisis and recovery, two very different people discovered something neither expected. Sometimes the most important person in a crowded room is the one nobody notices until it is too late. Fortunately for Alexander Hayes, Ethan Brooks noticed in time.